It is officially welcome to Sunday, May 21st call. I had sorry, I probably will be trying to clear my throat here until I start to talk a bit more. An interesting day yesterday. It was my mom's 75th birthday, and so we drove to Edmonton to celebrate, and it was a big celebration. So my mom and dad are the remaining aunts and uncles left. My dad was born 20 years later than the oldest sibling, which is a sister. And so they've kind of taken over that patriarchal and matriarchal position with the family. And so it was a family reunion and a lot of people showed up. So when I was driving yesterday, I was quite stressed out about it. So I had a very tumultuous relationship with my parents, and the feeling of being the black sheep and not belonging has been predominantly in my life. And to be honest, I was surprised how anxious I was, because for me, the opinion that I had, the story was that I've done all of this work, and that should mean then that I should be able to enter this relationship, go into this scenario, and have no stress at all. And that's not the case at all. And so I was nauseated and stressed out. And Rob and I were driving yesterday to Edmonton, and he said, "You're like, kind of what's happening?" And I said, "It's really interesting. Like here, I thought that I was good, that I've done all this work, and I shouldn't, feel this way." And as I was heard myself talk out loud, of course, because our voice has a vibration to it as well, and I could hear the words, I was in awareness of how judgmental I was being. And it was a soft judgment. This is the insidiousness of judgment. I should not feel this way, right? And so when I realized that I was in judgment of self because I was feeling a certain way, I was able to relax a little bit. I became aware that the feelings that I had were from my past. It was not a present day feeling. To be honest, there's a trauma response that we have, right? And especially with family, we can have, and if the word trauma doesn't resonate with you, you can use a different word. But remember, our brains are so powerful that it's created a neural pathway. So when you find yourself in a situation and you're not present, right? So I wasn't in my now, I was in the future. I was thinking about when I arrived there, who was going to be there, what was going to happen, who was, right? So I was creating worry, doubt, and fear without really even knowing that I was creating worry, doubt, or fear, because my brain, right? My neural pathways were immediately with parents don't belong. Remember, when we have this don't belong, we also immediately go into death. Our brains are wired that way, right? So with my parents don't belong, it means death. And so by the time that I got there, I was doing much better. And then I realized that I wasn't worried or doubt or fear. There was still a little bit of anxiety, but there was also excitement. So the second point for today is sometimes anxiousness or anxiety or worry can feel very similar to our bodies as excitement. And the only difference is the words that we attach to it, or the images that we attach to it. So this is why it's so important for us to really get in tune, in touch with our bodies, and your body will direct you. Like you could ask your body this specific question: am I anxious? Right? Am I worried? Is this what worry feels in my body? Is this what doubt feels like? Is this what anxiousness feels like? Is this what excitement feels like, and your body will respond a certain way. It takes practice, and depending on your human design type, right, it takes practice. Generators and manifesting generators, you will instinctively have that that guttural like manifestors, it's more of a sense, right? And reflectors and projectors were just a little bit different. Like a projector will still have that, but it might even feel like a knowing versus a gut response, and it'll depend on what kind of projector you are. So just know that you can also use the tool of human design to help you establish how to talk to your body, so you can hear how your body responds to you. So as I was driving there and I'm realizing that my body and brain immediately went into fight, flight, or freeze. I was in a trauma response. And so there are certain tools that we have that we can use. You can use deep breathing for that. You can use something called the vagus nerve stimulation. I won't show you today what that is, though, but although I think that probably over this next week that'll happen. But YouTube has some great examples. So vagus, VAGUS stimulation, that will help you also. But as always, I move into the universal laws. So if I'm experiencing one thing, if I'm feeling anxiety, doubt, fear, a sense of not belonging, the sense of death, I have, and this is where the intellect is important, I have the ability to recognize then that the opposite is available right here and right now. I don't have to go searching for it. I don't have to go looking for it. So what's also available is peace and joy and a sense of belonging and serenity and love. And all I had to do was remind myself of that. That takes practice. That wouldn't have necessarily happened right away for me years ago when I started my journey. But next, I started to reflect upon the universal law of forgiveness. And so as I started to think about what that looks like, and honestly, the universal law of forgiveness and the universal law of obedience has been the most difficult for me. Obedience meaning not obeying a person or an entity. Obedience means obeying the laws. But I had a challenge with the word obedience, so I was in resistance to obedience. And forgiveness for me, although I understood the concept and knew the importance of it, at the time that I started practicing this was when Darcy and I split up, and there was part of me that didn't want him to. I didn't want to forgive him. I really wanted him to. I wanted him to suffer as much as I was suffering, and I'm sure that I had that experience so that I could wrestle with what forgiveness was for me at that level, and then move into forgiveness. And it started simply by a conversation I had actually with my mom, which was she asked me if I'd be willing to forgive Darcy. And I said no. And then she said, would you be willing to be willing? And I said, and I was tapping into my body, right? And probably part of my intellect. And it was no. And then she said, would you be willing to be willing to be willing? And the answer was still no. And then she said, would you be willing to be willing to be willing to be willing? There's 4 willings. And that was like, maybe. And the 5th willing, I was like, okay, yeah, I can do that. And it was like one of the best lessons that my mom shared with me was that the forgiveness starts if there's a willingness to forgive. And there wasn't, which is why it didn't happen. But there was all of these willings to be willings. And because I knew that the only person truly that was suffering by not forgiving him was me and my children. And so to be transparent, it was the kids. It was because they were suffering because of me. And so I was inspired encouraged to take action because I didn't want them to be part of a family that was fighting, right? And part of that was the motivation was Darcy and I never fought, so the kids were not used to fighting. I should say never. I think we had like truly like a handful of fights in all the years, and so just an awareness of the effect that my, and I will say poor attitude was having on them. And so that's when I was willing to do the work behind forgiveness. And I don't know if you know much about forgiveness. I mean, I grew up in a Catholic home, although we didn't go to church. There was forgiveness talked about a little bit as my parents entered into the 12-step program. One of the steps is to make amends for the people that you've hurt. And so forgiveness was kind of talked about at that point in time. But I wanted to share with you a few points of the law of forgiveness that really made a difference to me. And again, tap in and check the language, because there's some interesting language here that I don't resonate with. And there's interesting language in here, of course, that I'm still in resistance to. And it kind of starts with this statement: a man who is great enough to forgive is always greater than the forgiven. He is superior. He is greater than his adversary. Adversary. And so for me, the challenge with the word is superior. And although I understand contextually what he's saying, I give meaning to the word superior. So why I'm sharing this with you is that if we just took the words and there was no meaning to any of the words that we were in resistance to, we'll hear the message differently. And this is so important, because how many times a day is one triggered by what someone says or someone does? And it's because we give them meaning. So if he was using those words for distinguishment, for not for judgment, but to describe something, then we would know that he's using the universal law of relativity, which is, how do you know something is bigger or better than the other? Is you have something to compare it to. So if it's not, if we can remove that it's intended for judgment, and it's just intended for discrepancy, to make a description of the thing. It removes then the heat, right? The meaning. And then we can take the words as, a man who is great enough to forgive is always greater than the forgiven. He's superior. He's greater. Right? And so it's your ego that's telling you that superior isn't good, or good language or bad language. And so sometimes we need to ask our ego, like our inner I, just to step aside and feel the vibration, right, of the message. And so the quality of forgiveness, he says, must be as limitless as faith, hope, and love. Again, thinking about the context. As a rule, there is a separation made between sin and its many effects. When a man sins, we've been taught to think that this was a job for the minister, and so he's called to pray for the sinner. When a man becomes sick and distressed in mind and body from the effects of his sins he's committed, we call for a doctor. The doctor, in turn, endeavors to treat or repair the body and arrest the suffering. This, at best, we know is but a temporary measure, for no healing or permanent cure can be effected until the doctor and the minister work together. So again, there's these incredible points, throughout the book, which is Working with the Law by Raymond Holliwell, about the idea of our mind, body, and soul working together, that all three are necessary. I'll say for balance, right? All three are necessary for the balance. And so, in fact, and I can't remember the true definition of sin, so I apologize, but how we were conditioned to what sin is the actual definition of sin is different. And it goes something like, my interpretation of it is going against the laws is sinful. So not judgment like we have, and the way that we've been conditioned. So when healthy and natural ideas fill the mind, the body will take on a like condition. So we're talking about the mind, the body, and the soul working together. And we're talking about forgiveness of self, forgiveness of quote unquote sin, forgiveness of past actions. And the most important piece of this for me, when I started to look at this, was if I'm forgiving someone, like if I feel like someone needs forgiveness, that would mean that someone would have had something to do to me, that someone, I would have to have the thought process, the attitude, the thoughts that someone is doing something to me. But if we go into applying the universal laws and we go, everything happens for me, nothing happens to me, and no one's doing anything to me, the actions are happening, things are going on, I give it a meaning, and the meaning then defines what that means for me. And then that meaning could lead to, well, I need to forgive them. But what I'm proposing is, it's not about forgiving them. It's about you. Everyone is a reflection of you. Now, that can be really tough when we have situations like my ex-husband and his behavior. So, not my fault, that's different. Not my responsibility, that's different. But knowing that I created and manifested every situation in my life. And so the forgiveness isn't of the other person, because they're simply there as a mirror, as a guide, karma, depending on, again, there's like so many ways you can look at this. So there's no need to forgive them. The forgiveness comes back to forgive me for maybe even giving that situation a meaning, because it could have a different meaning. To forgive myself. So I'll talk about this specifically with Darcy, to forgive myself, because intuitively there were times throughout my marriage that I knew something was going on, but I didn't want to rock the boat. I liked my life and I liked my lifestyle. And the thought of being alone, I was very, very afraid, right? And so I didn't have as much self-value, as much self-worthiness. Our relationship became norm. And because that kind of was normal, I'm just going to take a sip of my drink here to wet my whistle. And the thing was, that was a normal relationship for me, because those are the relationships that I entered from childhood, programming and conditioning from childhood. So it was normal until it wasn't. So the universal law of forgiveness, we start with ourselves. And you still may feel, as I did, that I needed, that part of the forgiveness piece was to forgive them, but I had to remove the, because they did this to me. They didn't do anything to me. They did something. There was an action taken. And my conditioning told me that that action was wrong. Again, I'm not saying it wasn't wrong. So just kind of follow the energy of what I'm saying. So when we move into this self-reflection, this self-forgiveness, what it does do is it opens us up to see the part that we participated in, right? To see that. and not with responsibility or blame, but accountability, maybe. All the accountability piece. Also, we can move into and practice the universal law of forgiveness. So scientists accept the truth that the body of man is moved by the mind. That all its functioning is governed by a ruling thought, whether that thought is subjective or objective, whether it's conscious or unconscious. Those who study the mental processes find that all the conditions of the body are created or caused by the mind. It is known that the creation in any and every form is governed by and subject to law. Here's the definition of sin. Hence, when one misuses, inverts, or violates a law, this mistake is called a sin. So that's actually the definition of sin, not the conditioned response or the definition that, at least that I was provided for when I was growing up. A mistake is falling short of or disobeying the law. So again, this may be tough to handle, was for me, because I had a meaning for sin and it didn't match this meaning. And so as I was working on forgiveness of sin means that we must forgive, forsake, and forget that thought or person who conditioned, which prompted the sin. So what this allowed me to do in the forgiveness of what was going on in the relationship with Darcy was I started to see that he was conditioned in a way that led him to behave in a way. I was conditioned in a way that led me to behave in a way. And there was no right or wrong, good or bad, right? That's the discerning piece. So letting go of judgment and learning about discernment. So he did what he did because he was programmed to do what he did. I did what I did because of my conditioning and my programming. So who's right? No one. Who's wrong? No one. Now, this took practice. Right? This took practice for me to lay blame or shame or try to guilt him into things. It took practice not to point the finger and tell him how awful he was of a person, of a human being. And it's interesting as years have gone by, people move into a judgment and they ask me what happened, and they move into judgment, and I just say he's like it's okay. What he did wasn't okay, but he was conditioned. He was programmed that way. Just like I was conditioned and programmed to behave the way that I behaved. So then if we move into forgiveness, if we move into this, forgiveness is first the requirement which permits man to be in harmony with the law of our being. So I'm not sure if you've ever heard this. I mean, again, I grew up with this. Forgiveness, we have forgiveness not to absolve the other person of their behavior, but forgiveness so we can have peace and harmony, right? Because if we're not in a practice in the law of forgiveness, I don't know about you, but that just like judgment and non-forgiveness really eat away at me. Like I get really the shadow side of myself, again, not good or bad, but the shadow self of me really rises to that, right? So when I have the judgment piece, or when I move into a non-forgiveness, and so I can feel peace in my body when I move into forgiveness. And so I personally use Ho'oponopono, which is a Hawaiian prayer, right? I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Thank you. I love you. Now, some people put it in a different order. I don't think that really matters. And this is an ancient healing prayer. And you don't even have to logically know who you're saying it to or what you're saying it about, but it has this effect. Bunyan. And there's a great story, and I might not have all the details 100%, but one of the initiators, that Dr. Hewlin, that was practicing Ho'oponopono, he was a psychiatrist, and he was asked to work in an insane asylum in Hawaii. And so he, I think at first the story is that he said no, and then he went in and he started to practice Ho'oponopono on the building, on the land, excuse me, on the inmates, on the staff. And so the concept behind Ho'oponopono is it brings you back to what's ground zero. So it's completely accepting that everyone is a mirror for you and to you, right? And so if they're a mirror for you, that we will accept our part, the energetic part in what's going on. And so using Ho'oponopono brings everyone back to ground zero. There's a great book written by Dr. Vitale, Vitale, called Ground Zero, I think. And it's about Ho'oponopono and how he got introduced to it. And so he would walk through the hallways and do the prayer. I'm sorry, please forgive me. Thank you. I love you. And that's all he did. He walked through all the hallways. But the energy there was so bad that not even a plant would survive. And so what he does is, so then he would take a file, someone's file, and he'd sit with the file. And he would review the file and he would do the prayer. He didn't even see any of the patients. All he did for years, every day, 365 days a year, would do the Ho'oponopono. Now, eventually, all but a handful of inmates that were not curable were quote unquote cured, and either released out into the public, or they if they went to different jails for their crimes, but they weren't in an insane asylum anywhere. So the power of this prayer is huge, right? I listen to it lots. It's part of my meditation, or when I'm doing dishes, I'll just play it. You can find it on YouTube. And again, the ones on YouTube aren't in the same order, and I don't know if that's important. I've just kind of let it go. A part of my brain, is like, no, this is the way it has to be, right? That's my intellect, right? That wanting things to be in a certain order. But it's a great prayer. And it really truly does for me. That's what I used to move into forgiveness. So I could forgive myself and forgive Darcy and forgive all the players in the game that were that participated in what I see as the breakdown of the marriage. Right? And so there's one more thing I just want to share with you real quick. Hang on. He talks about having sinful thoughts. And what he means by that is sinful thoughts, meaning not thoughts in congruency with the laws. So judgment can be a sinful thought, judgment of self or judgment of others, right? That can be regarded in the context of how it's explained here. Lower density energy thoughts, in the context of what he's saying here, could be a sinful thought. Again, no judgment, but just being an awareness of, I'm committing a sin is happening, or I'm committing a sin. And for me, for me, it was important that I claimed this. As I was committing a sin against my body, every time I said something that wasn't in alignment with the truth of who I was, I realized I was committing a sin against my body, against against the God mind, against the divine person who I am. So I became really aware of what am I thinking? What am I saying? And again, the awareness came not because I was trying to manipulate my future, meaning I was trying to manipulate my future to have more prosperity or more abundance or more health through manipulation. but rather because I started to see and feel and hear like the effects of not living the law, not embodying the law was having on me. And that there's a little bit of a difference, right? One is manipulation, one is surrender, right? One is surrender. So as you're applying the laws, embodying the laws, I guess I'm being asked to, I'm being guided to ask you just to check in. Are you trying to manipulate? Right? And it's okay, quote unquote. There's no judgment in that. It's just discernment. Oh, interesting. I'm trying to manipulate the law. I'm using the universal law of reciprocity, right, as an example. So that, and then insert the so that piece of it. All right. I'm just gonna check the chat. Oh, Diane, I love that. Diane writes, I have an alarm set on my phone to say Ho'oponopono twice a day. Oh, and you even know how to spell it. I never know how to spell it. I just start adding the H's and O's. So, excellent. Thank you so much for all of you for being here with me today. I certainly appreciate it. And have an incredible day. For my Albertans, we've been advised to stay in because of the ash in the air. And so stay safe. Love you so much. Thank you very much for coming. Appreciate you being here.